begin where we began 2 weeks ago. October 27, 95, Larry Hunter leaves home first thing in the morning. Has surgery on his shoulder, expected to be home that afternoon, back to work on Monday. Life was good. But for all practical purposes, life would end that day. By the first of the next week, he was declared brain dead. We say because of negligence. I told you in opening what the issues were. One was Dr. Euro negligent by deviating from the standard of care for an anesthesiologist. Yes or no? We ask you to answer that question. In your minds, yes. And did that negligence cause the death of Larry Hunter? I told you then what we would prove on those two issues. That in fact, loss of cerebral perfusion pressure, unresponded to by Dr. Euro, caused Larry Hunter's death. I believe it we proved. The issues that you are called upon to decide, again, was there a deviation from the standard of care that did cause Larry Hunter's death? And if the answer to those two is yes, then that means you have found fault. That's the question that you will answer on the verdict. Do you find fault? Fault is a function of those two things, standard of care and cause. The judge is going to give you the instructions on it. And then if the answer is yes, you will be called upon to determine the amount of damages. Now, on all of those issues, the burden of proof rests on us, the plaintiffs. What does that mean? The judge is going to explain it to you. It means that we are required to convince you only that it's more likely than not that there is fault and that there are damages as a result of that fault. Scales of justice sitting up here are tipped a little bit, but actually when we start this case, they're in balance. They're even. And the burden of proof only requires that we tip those scales ever so slightly. And if we do that, we've met that burden of proof. I want to discuss with you why I believe that we've met that burden. And one feature of it is very simple. It would take 2 weeks to go back over all of the testimony you've heard. We're not going to do that. But you could, and I submit that you should, analyze it, not totally, but at least significantly and substantially on this one fact. Dr. Witt says that there was a deviation from the standard of care, and he explained to you why. And every opinion that he gave you is supported by the medical literature. That vast body of information that is shared among medical professionals for the purpose of improving the level of knowledge of people who practice medicine for the purpose of enhancing patient safety. And everything that Dr. Witt said to you is supported in the medical literature. On the other hand, the defendants say, well, what Dr. Euro did was okay. Not one basis for that in the scientific literature. They could not provide you any medical literature to support their version and their defense of this case. Think about that. Everything that we say is supported by the literature, and nothing that the defense says is supported by the literature. You will recall the constant challenges I made to Dr. Eichel and Dr. Euro. Just give us one literature citation to support that. Make it good. That alone should be enough to have convincing effect that we carry the burden of proof in this case. And what we have talked to you about is good medicine supported by conventional wisdom in the healthcare sciences. And they, on the other hand, can provide you nothing like that. The number is zero that they have provided you. In your mind's eye for a moment, imagine this. Dr. Witt told you he's a board examiner for anesthesiologists to become board certified, so is Dr. Eichhorn. To explain to you the way that works, the candidate comes in, they've had a few minutes to review a case, a hypothetical case, and they walk into a room with two of those board examiners, and those board examiners then question them on how they would handle the case, and whether they pass or fail depends on how they answer those questions. In that mind's eye, let's go to a board examination. Let's have those two examiners in that room be Dr. Eichhorn and Dr. Witt. Let's have the candidate outside reviewing, hypothetically, this case. Now that candidate walks into that room, and the first question is this. The head elevated position in a shoulder surgery. What are you going to do to assure cerebral perfusion pressure so that the brain gets oxygen? First candidate answers the question this way. Well, I'm not really going to do anything because, as far as I know, if I keep the heart and the lungs and the kidneys and the liver perfused and they're getting oxygen, then I'm going to assume that the brain's okay too, even though it's above the heart. Second candidate comes in, same question, same case, same two examiners, and answers the question this way. Well, I know that forever it's been reported repeatedly, frequently, in the literature that there is a gravitational effect, which means that the cerebral perfusion pressure in the brain is going to be less. It's called postural hypotension. And you have to accommodate for that risk according to what everything ever written in medicine says. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to disregard that. And I'm simply going to assume that there's no significant difference despite the law of gravity and despite what all the medical literature says, and I'm simply going to watch the blood pressure at the level of the heart, and if it's enough there for the heart, then I'm going to assume the brain's going to be okay, and I'm going to disregard all that medical knowledge. Third candidate comes in, same case, same questions, and answers the question. But you have to recognize when you're operating that there are adverse effects from general anesthesia that makes the brain unable to auto-regulate itself as it is normal. And that's made worse, doctors, by the fact that the head's above the heart and you've got the gravitational effect. So I'm probably not going to take a direct measurement of how high the head above the heart is, but I certainly can look at it and get real close on estimations, whether it's 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 inches, depending on how tall the patient is. And I know that if I do the calculation from those inches of elevation of the head above the heart and convert that to centimeters of water by multiplying by 2.54 and converting that to millimeters of mercury by a factor of 0.7, that I will then know the gravitational effect. I'm not going to do that. I'm simply going to eyeball it and say it's 8 inches, and I know, rounded off, that's 2 millimeters of mercury. So every time I look at that machine and it says the mean arterial pressure is 90, then I know in the brain it's not 90. I know now it's going to be 74. I can easily do that. And I'm going to factor in intracranial pressure because it's going to be normal in this case of about 10, and I know the number will be 64. If I start getting into a level of concern, I'm going to change the anesthetic medications and raise that blood pressure so that this patient is not brain dead at the end of the case. Ask yourself this question: which one of those three passes the boards? Very interesting, a couple of days ago, that we saw a demonstration done by Dr. Ura where they borrowed the anesthesia machine and went through a very interesting description of the process of putting someone to sleep and how the monitors work and so forth. Wasn't it also interesting that we didn't get the bed or the position to demonstrate, as he says, that if you put the patient at that angle, you'll see there's no significant difference? Question. Isn't it interesting that they brought you a picture of a bed, an operating bed, just the bed, not the position, at what Dr. Ura called the beach chair position. But we didn't see that picture taken with the positioner on that bed and demonstrating precisely what the angle is. And we're not going to fight any great deal over whether it's 45 degrees or 30 degrees. But if you look back, as I showed you on that screen, at the way the manufacturer says to do it, and everybody that sees, including Dr. Ura, that the position is set 45 degrees. The patient's body angle is maintained by the position, not by the bed. You will see, as he said in this case, the bottom of that position is level to the floor, even when they flex the knees. And it's great. Maybe more is after all of this that's been going on, all the questions that have been asked of various doctors over all of these years, Dr. Ura says, one, that he got ready to come here to court, he hadn't done any research. His patient died. But he did no research to find out why. A lawsuit was filed against him. Questions were asked over a long period of time of him and others that related to the issues in this case and the criticisms that have been made toward his management of this case. But he didn't bother to do the depositions to see the criticism. But he's heard and has known for a long, long time what we say the management of this case should have been, and that is supported and has been supported forever in the medical literature. But he tells you, I still haven't changed it. I still do it the same way. I still, in effect, ignore what the medical literature has been saying for decades upon decades upon decades. It ain't the way I do it, and I'm not changing. Ladies and gentlemen, on October 27, 1995, because of that very reason, a train wreck happened. The cost of that train wreck was Larry Hunter's life. And if it's true, that in spite of what Dr. Ura has become aware of, if he didn't know it before, what he has become aware of through the information that has been presented to him in this case, for him to say he still hasn't changed it only tells us that there's another train wreck out there getting ready to happen. Curious about National Anesthesia Services and heard depositions of two of Dr. Ura's partners, Dr. Obermeyer and Dr. Head. If what Dr. Ura has said, and Dr. Eichel, in fact, is true, and it's okay to ignore all this medical knowledge, don't you think that at least one or more of Dr. Ura's partners would have come in here and told you that? Not one of his own partners took the time to come in this courtroom and share with you their feelings that he did right. Don't you know they would have if they don't, if they could have? And I want to talk to you for a moment about what Dr. Obermeyer and Dr. Ura said. Phil, if you will put up Dr. Obermeyer first, please. That's an arrow drawn down. It didn't come off very good. But Dr. Obermeyer can see that a loss of cerebral perfusion pressure would explain this result. And let's remember this. Dr. Obermeyer and Dr. Head's depositions were taken in this case because both of them had contact in the treatment of Larry Hunter. Dr. Obermeyer, before and after the surgery, he did the block. And Dr. Head, after the surgery in the recovery room, as this problem surfaced. Whereas Dr. Ura testified that prior to this case he had never heard of a way to calculate the mean arterial pressure in the brain when the head is elevated above the heart. Dr. Obermeyer had. Dr. Obermeyer said there was a way to calculate the difference in the mean arterial pressure, and he had read it. He said he didn't remember the formula, but he was familiar with it and knew it existed and knew about it before this case. And finally, Dr. Obermeyer says the one thing: evermore almighty yes, we agree. This is the worst thing I have ever seen. We agree. Dr. Head, also of National Anesthesia Services. The second one I want to talk to you about first. He testified that he did not know of any cause for Larry Hunter's death that would be more likely than ventilation or cerebral perfusion pressure, not cerebral perfusion by occlusion or compression. He said he did not know of any cause more likely than ventilation or cerebral perfusion pressure to explain the outcome in this case. Now, everybody agrees it wasn't a ventilation problem or the record's inaccurate. We know that he did not have a sustained ventilation problem because we know as an undisputed fact, this is nobody's opinion, this is a fact in this case. Larry Hunter's other vital organs were perfectly normal. That heart was normal, the lungs were normal, the kidneys were normal, the liver was normal. So he did not have a ventilation problem. That leaves Dr. Head with only one explanation: cerebral perfusion pressure. And we agree. So he says on first entry, with no other explanation, and he doesn't have ventilation, loss of cerebral perfusion pressure, underlying pressure, loss of cerebral perfusion pressure would be the cause of Larry Hunter's death. Not a cause, the cause. We agree. Bring it up a little bit. Dr. Uri, you heard say desflurane improves autoregulation. It's not just Dr. Witt's word that that's wrong. Dr. Hill, Dr. Uri's partner, says that's wrong. He says desflurane adversely affects autoregulation. And so the idea of this gravitational effect of the head above the heart, Dr. Head says when operating with the head above the heart, we do consider cerebral perfusion pressure. Remember, Dr. Uri says he does not, because he's just assuming that the cerebral perfusion pressure will be okay if he's got the pressure okay at the heart. Dr. Head does not agree. When operating with the head above the heart, we do consider cerebral perfusion pressure to make sure the mean arterial pressure is high enough to pump the blood uphill to the heart. We agree. Dr. Head assumes that the intracranial pressure of 10 is 10 in a surgery like this when the head is elevated above the heart. We agree. And then revisit what I told you about a moment ago. Dr. Head said, based on his familiarity with this case, being involved with this patient, reviewing the record, he could not offer a standard of care opinion on Dr. Uri's measure. Dr. Head, based on his familiarity with how Dr. Uri did this, felt that what Dr. Uri did was okay, don't you know, he was supporting his partner. He could not and would not offer a standard of care opinion. I want to talk to you briefly because there's very few things that I have to say about this. The defendant's occlusion theory. Remember Dr. Iyer, who is the only person who has said that the explanation for Larry Hunter's death was not in the cerebral perfusion pressure, but it was rather, in his opinion, that the right side was blocked by the interscalene block, forming a ping-pong-sized ball up against the right carotid and the left side was occluded when the head was turned because of the elongated styloid process. He's the only one who said it. Let's think for a moment about who disagrees with that. Dr. Europe, Dr. Obermeyer, Dr. Head, Dr. Witt, and not unimportantly, Dr. Pierce, the guy who did the autopsy. Because when he saw that styloid process, he said, I thought that might explain blockage on the left side, and I looked at the rest of the vascular system to see if there was a reason there, and there was not. So Dr. Pierce, disproved that theory. It doesn't work, and it doesn't work for a number of reasons. He wasn't satisfied that the interscalene block on the operative side would block off the right carotid. He found no reason for the right side to be blocked. But he said even if it was, even if you assumed for the sake of argument that it wasn't, but if you thought that it was, the vertebrals are still going to perfuse the brain. And there is nothing wrong with the vertebrals. And there is nothing that would have compromised those vertebrals. And they're going to go into circle of Willis. And circle of Willis is still going to distribute that blood out to the brain. And that excludes the styloid process from having any effect on this case. Nobody agrees with Dr. Eichhorn. It took Dr. Eichhorn 2.5 years after he became involved in this case to think. And he didn't think about it on his own. He thought about it as a result of that case report from 1973, Mr. Davidson. He says the like. If that mechanical explanation was true, we would have heard about that soon. Even Dr. Eichhorn says, I do not have enough expertise to say that the vertebrals would not have taken care of the brain anyway. But he does not dispute Dr. Pierce. And he does not dispute Dr. Witt. And he does not dispute Dr. Balfour about the ability of these clean, working vertebrals that nobody says there was an excuse for blockage on. Dr. Eichhorn said, in order to explain this, in order to say that the styloid process included the left carotid, there has to be turning of the head. Well, was the head turned? Not according to Dr. Renzo, and not according to Dr. Ure, so far as Dr. Ure knew on the occasions that we checked. There is no evidence that the head turned. Dr. Eichhorn admits that. And so I asked him, Dr. Eichhorn, then even if you assume that the head turns and there's an elongated styloid process on the left, how far would that head have to turn in order to block or compress or occlude that artery? I don't know. Far enough to do this. Not very scientific. Dr. Eichhorn, if you assume that the head turned and you assumed it turned far enough, how long would it have to be over there compressing that carotid? I don't know. Long enough. Well, Dr. Eichhorn, if you have to have these in combination with the right side, where there's a ping-pong-sized ball collection that's not normal, that nobody felt, which he admits they would feel if they felt, that nobody saw, which he admits they would see if they looked. But even if you assume that it's there, don't you agree that that dissipates? That's the effect of the block. As soon as you put it in, it's at maximum size and concentration, and the objective is for it to spread out and dissipate and be absorbed. Yes. So, then when is it, you say, in this dissipation process, that this mythical turning of the head to the left occurred? I don't know. Think of all the I don't knows that Dr. Eichhorn put into his hypothesis. He had to admit that there's no objective evidence to say that either the left side or right side conclusion is true. Ladies and gentlemen, objective evidence is what you should use and be guided by in making your decisions. But all of that having been said, I respectfully submit to you that on this occlusion theory that only Dr. Eichhorn has, is best met with this simple fact. If it happened to Larry Hunter, and one assumes that, in spite of there being no evidence that it happened, in spite of nobody really knowing mechanically how it could happen, it would be, by their own admission, the first case in the history of the world that that's happened. Remember, many, not right, many tens of thousands of these procedures are done exactly like this every year in this country, and more than that worldwide. And it's been going on for at least 2, maybe 3 decades. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who've had Larry Hunter's exact surgery with the scaling block on the right, and the angled head-up position is always done that way. Same basic anesthetic medications. And at the last deposition, it was 1 in 25, according to Dr. Acorn. Here, he wants to go with 1 in 50. I'm fine with that. 1 out of every 50 of those hundreds of thousands of patients over all that period of time had the identical risk factors that Larry Hunter had to suffer brain damage and death because of the combined effects of the elongated styloid, the turning of the head, and the block on the right. No explanation for the gratuitous. And not one time, not one single time has it ever happened. By the way, there's never been a single case reported of a styloid process during surgery, including even one side. One guy accidentally heard noise in the room. Don't know what it was from. It could have been from plaque. They took that patient straight into the operating room, operated on him, a young man. The patient did that. Not one single case ever in the history of medicine reporting that scaling block actually proves that block. Not one single reported case in medical history ever that scaling block has included a carotid artery. Never. So this would have to be a first. It would have to be a first when there's been literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands, on and on and on of opportunities for it to happen. That's about where those scales are on that issue. He has to admit he has no medical scientific literature support for that opinion. That everybody else disagrees with him. If you find that we have carried that burden of proof, that this death was a result of negligence, that Dr. Euro should have accounted for cerebral perfusion pressure and the difference in the effect of the head being elevated above the heart, but that he did not. And if the cause of Larry Hunter's death was as a result of a loss of that cerebral perfusion pressure, then you would have answered question number 1 on the verdict form. Now, first question you're going to be called upon to decide is were the defendants, J. Michael Buick, MD, and National Anesthesia Services is all matter at fault. We ask that you answer that yes, because the 2 factors of fault again are negligence and cause. That's what makes up the fault. We ask that you answer question number 1 yes. And if you do answer question number 1 yes, then you will go to question number 2, and that is what amount of damages were sustained by the plaintiffs for the wrongful death of Larry Hunter. Let's go. I want to show you the different issues that you'll be called upon to calculate. That needs to be focused a little bit. There we go. You will recall that the first witness that testified before you was Dr. Brookshire, the economist, who had calculated for you what you will hear the judge tell you you are to calculate. And that is the present value of loss of earning capacity and the uncontested numbers that Dr. Brookshire presents you $2,755,125 already reduced to present value and already subtracting from that those maintenance expenses that under the law he would be required to spend during the course of the rest of his life had he lived in order to maintain his state of health to such a degree that he would have been able to continue to earn money. Dr. Brookshire has already done all those calculations for him. $2,755,125. And remember, what present value means is you take that number and invest it, and with the interest, at the end of his work life expectancy, there would be no money left. In addition, it is stipulated in this case that the medical expenses incurred because of the damage done to his brain was $43,950, and the funeral expenses were $11,000 plus. So that the total amount of objective damages, $2,810,435.64. Those are objective numbers that we have placed before you. Let's bring it up. But there's more. Just for a moment, put the verdict form back there. And then we'll put this back. You'll see on question number 2, if you're assessing damages, medical expenses, well, you got that number. Funeral expenses, you got that number. Third issue is mental suffering of Larry Hunter from time of injury to time of death. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then fourth is the pecuniary value of the life of Larry Hunter. And that includes the loss of earning capacity that we talked about. And it also includes the loss of consortium claims of Sherry Hunter and the sons, Ben Hunter and Joey Hunter. So let's go back to the break. You'll notice on the objective numbers up there, I filled those in for you. Those are cold numbers that are done. I have not said what we think you should put in for the mental suffering and for these consortium claims for Sherry Hunter, Ben Hunter, and Joey Hunter. And there's a reason. Those numbers are what you say they should be. It's not the job of the lawyers to fill in that blank and tell you that the loss of Joey Hunter and Ben Hunter, for the loss of the love, companionship, the guidance, that family relationship with their father was worth X amount. That's something that the collective wisdom and experience of 12 people in this community can do. And it's not for me to tell you what value that is. But I will tell you this. We believe, and we ask you to believe, that when you start valuing the loss of a father to a child, the loss of a spouse to the other spouse, that that's not an insignificant thing, and it is not an inconsequential number. And we ask you to value that, to show that in this community, if not this country, one thing that we put great weight and great faith and great value is family, love, and all that goes with it. The judge is going to tell you the legal components to that, but it all boils down to the value of that family relationship between the spouse, between the parent and a child. And we ask that you provide a significant number. Now you will have to, you've only got one blank now. That consortium is combined with the loss of earning capacity. But you'll have to consider each one of those elements separately and value them separately and then combine them into one number. And finally, the mental suffering of Larry Hunter. Larry Hunter's brain was mortally wounded in that surgery. He wasn't dead when he came out of the operating room, the recovery room. He was a dead man. He was going to be dead. There was no question about it. But the brain wasn't totally dead. It took it a period of time to die. I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that we have demonstrated to you through initially 2 witnesses that for a period of hours before that brain deteriorated so badly that Larry Hunter had no more awareness of his surroundings, that he not only had awareness of his surroundings, but he could hear what was being said, and he could understand what was being said. If you recall the testimony of the nurse, who recorded in this record that in those first hours, there were occasions where he was responsive to command. One of those was by taking his hand and saying, squeeze. And he would squeeze. And say, okay, turn loose. And he would turn loose. And that meant to her that he could hear and he could understand. Dr. Ura said, I saw it once myself. And it appeared that he could understand what the nurse was saying. The reason I point that out is this. There were a number of witnesses that I asked, and you heard say, during the course of that day, when we were trying to figure out what had happened, what had gone wrong, or what was going to happen. All that discussion was taking place at his bedside. For him to hear and understand that something grave, one of the witnesses used the word grave, something grave is going on. What is the value of the mental suffering endured by Larry Hunter during that period of hours where he could hear all these discussions about what had gone wrong? Would he ever? I wouldn't. That, I respectfully submit to you, is not an insignificant feature of this case. And so those are the two questions that you're going to be called upon to answer. Thank you. You're told what you would be required to do if you came down. You're going to be called upon to sit on a jury and decide the case. You didn't know what kind of case you were going to be called upon to decide. And I'm not going to suggest to you that the responsibility that you now take into that jury room is light one. Certainly not. And I don't even suggest to you that carrying that responsibility lets this job be easy no matter how much you think the proof is one-sided. It's not. This is a civil case. And the only way to answer under our law and our system and our civilization and our society for a wrongful death is through compensation of money damages. We ask in this case that 6.5 years after Larry Hunter's death that it be answered by saying this was a preventable death. Just like those authorities, not the least of which was the writings of one John Eichmann, who wrote for all his medical anesthesia professionals to see that based on his years of reviewing bad outcomes in anesthetics, it was usually the result of human error by the anesthetist, and the great majority are preventable. We ask that you find, in this case, that Larry Hunter's death was preventable.